codes as well. So the South African Code of Conduct was written and published in 2002, so that's nearly 20 years ago now. And if you want to pause the slide at this point, you can have a look at the kinds of statements or guidance that is given to South African teachers to help them, principles to help their action in their daily work in the classroom. Right, so hopefully before you go on to this next slide, you've had a chance to pause and think and just engage in a bit more depth with those slides. And I think if I'm looking at those, and I'm not South African, so I'm not an expert, I suggest if you want to read about what a South African teacher thinks about those that code and those principles, you should read the suggestion at the bottom of this slide. My Nurin Davids is a colleague on the project, and she's written about the standards and some of the issues with them as a South African teacher and teacher educator. So she can talk about it in depth. But what I would say very briefly is that any of the statements we look at, you do need to think about where they have come from. And the country's history and present are really reflected in these standard statements. It's very interesting. That's one of the reasons that why they're different, because each of the places has its own specific history. So in the case of the South African standards, if you look at those and you find out something about apartheid, and apartheid fortunately is no longer in existence, so South Africans would talk about being in a post-apartheid context now. They're after apartheid. Apartheid was a system basically of institutionalized racist segregation. It existed from about 1948 into the early 1990s, so only about 10 years before this statement of Code of Ethics was pulled together. Basically, it was this official state policy that white people were better than all other ethnicities. And that's why people like Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Walter Sisulu, other people you might have heard of who were South African, black South African protesters, political activists, that's why they took this system on, because it was unjust. And eventually they won, but you know, that was a long battle for 50 years fighting this racial segregation. So you can imagine if a statement has been written in the shadow of that kind of deep, difficult political situation, it will be reflected in the priorities that the country identifies for its teachers, really important moral principles, and it will be reflected in the language that's used. So if you look at that South African statement, I think, well, certainly I can't speak for you, but for myself, I think there's a big emphasis on rights, the rights of individuals, stuff about the equality, which is an important democratic value, as well as freedom, dignity. I wonder if this links at all to the work you've been doing on John Rawls. I know that that featured in another of your tutorials. Lots of responsibilities, duties, very powerfully described in this document, and which are absolute. And I think on the one hand it's very important to emphasise equality and dignity, and as I said, given the context in South Africa, no wonder those things are so important in people's minds, almost to the exclusion of other things. So when we come on to look at the Hong Kong Code of Conduct in a minute, we'll see much more about teaching and learning. This is a very political statement, and I'm saying that with a a small p. I'm not saying it belongs to a particular political party, and people will react to this statement perhaps in different ways. For some people, perhaps it's a bit individualistic. For other people, I think they'll find this a very inspiring statement. Personally, I find lists a bit of a problem. I think if you're trying to help people work out what to do in a situation, having a great big long list of lots of points to remember, that can be quite difficult to enact. On the one hand, I wonder if a list can capture absolutely everything that ought to be respected and all the rights that we ought to have and all the moral principles that we ought to be attentive to. It's quite hard. And on the other hand, some of these statements are quite difficult to interpret. So we can say, well, that's a very fine ideal, but what does that actually mean in the classroom, particularly as there aren't necessarily lots of teaching specific statements to be shared there. So there's some of my own reflections, but I've given you some questions, and I would love it if you could spend a bit of time looking at that statement. Look at the full statement, because the slide just gives you a little snapshot. Have a look at that document if you have the time and the inclination, and think about those questions about key values, similarities to ethical theories that you've studied, and what you think about that code. What do you think its strengths are? Can you identify any weaknesses? And I'll give you some ideas about limitations to codes a little bit later in the tutorial. Okay, now moving on to the next one, the next example. And here I hesitate because I'm very confident that you in Hong Kong are far more expert on the Code for the Education Profession of Hong Kong than I am, because this will be something that you need to take on board, I think, when you're preparing for your practical teaching and going on into teaching. And I'm so sorry that I haven't had the opportunity to talk to you about your code and what you think about it, and have that opportunity for sharing. But never mind. At least we get to do some sharing through this online mode, so that's good and exciting. Again, and I'm not going to give you a link, and I'm certainly not going to tell you about your own history in Hong Kong, because I suspect you know far more about it than I do. But I note that this code was put together in 1995, so that's 25 years ago. That's before handover or going back to China, so that could be interesting. I think what's interesting for me as somebody coming from England with a background in teaching and professional education is I think there's quite a few similarities and influences from what the standards in England used to be like. They're quite different now, but in the 1990s they would be more like this. So maybe that shows some of the colonial influence, but I'm also interested that it hasn't really changed, and nobody's. So when we come on to England, we'll see that the standards have been revised several times since 1995. I was interested to see the article by Kwong that I've referred to at the bottom of the slide. Have a look at what he's got to say, because he basically says that people in Hong Kong are not that bothered by the Code of Conduct for Teachers. I think I've understood him, but do read what he says. Don't rely on my interpretation, because I might have got it wrong. That could explain why nobody's bothered to revise the standards since that time. You know, how far do these actually impact? What I like about these standards are they're very learner focused. There's lots of emphasis on students. I like the fact that there's a whole section around commitment to students. I don't know if you've heard of the concept of servant leadership, but I wonder if there's a connection between this way of thinking about the role of the teacher and how to behave, which is quite dutiful and subordinate, and that maybe there's a connection there. I know servant leadership is a very popular idea in Hong Kong and in the wider region. I'm also interested in the language of harmonious working relationships, because that's a very Hong Kong thing to me. We don't talk about harmonious working relationships in England. We have other words for this. So that's more evidence of how culturally specific these kinds of documents are. So I'm really missing your input here, and I don't want to tell you too much about your own documents. I'm really more offering you some reflections by me. I think you should have a look at Terence Kwong's document if you want to pursue this, and do have a look. It's quite a long document. I would say that again, there's quite a lot there, and I wonder how far people actually enact these principles when there's so much detail. But you know, maybe that fine-grained detail is really helpful, and people like having all that information. I'd be very interested to know what your thoughts were. And then finally, out of my 3 examples, and as I said earlier, there are lots of these. Most countries have standard statements for their teachers. Malaysia has interesting standards. Malta has interesting standards. Places like Australia and the States, they would have standards, not just one for the whole country, but for different states within those much larger countries or jurisdictions. So there's lots of them. I'd pick a region of the world that you're interested in, whatever it is, and maybe go and have a look and find out what they say, what advice they offer their teachers in that particular area. But back to England, as I explained earlier, in Hong Kong, there hasn't been much of a change since the 1990s, but in England, we had standards first in the 1980s, and we have revised them a number of times. And one of the things that we've been concerned to do, and so maybe my comments about long lists is a cultural thing, we've been very keen to reduce our standards down to a much shorter, more manageable statement. So there used to be 33 standards, and now we have about 10, and we have 2 pages. So this is not the whole of the standards. Part 1 has standards which are to do with teaching and learning, and then part 2 is the bit which is relevant here, which is to do with ethics. So that's the statement about personal and professional conduct. I think it's quite interesting that they separate out teaching and learning on one hand and teachers' professional conduct on the other, because I personally think that the 2 things need to be linked together. But no, we've got them separate in our official version, and I need to say a few things. I would point out it's actually quite hard to be brief when it's your own standards, because you know quite a lot about them, and also it's quite hard not to be biased because you have views about them, and perhaps I don't know, I'd be interested to know if you felt this. I feel like when it's my own standards, I feel it's easier to criticise because I'm inside them, but maybe that's wrong. So I mentioned when I was talking to the previous slide, I was a bit concerned that we separated out teaching and learning from professional conduct in general. And if you have a look, if you wanted to follow that point up, there's a paper that I did about philosophy for teachers. In there, we talk about this division in a bit more detail, and we basically say, well, professional conduct is inseparable from how you are in the classroom. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about pedagogical relations, or the relationships of teaching and how inescapably ethical it is. So I think that split into two is a bit unfortunate. If you also have a chance to look at those values, the one about British values and respecting British values, that's been very controversial back in England. Lots of people have objected to it. Not everybody. Some people like that statement. Perhaps the more patriotic people think that that one is really important. Other people question it and say, well, what do you mean by British values? What are British values distinctively? We're not saying that we shouldn't uphold democracy, rule of law, those sorts of things. Yes, we think that's important, but what actually is a British value? You can read about that. I haven't given you any specific references, but if you did some research, you would find lots of people who've been very critical about that one part of the Part B of the standards in particular.